Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Bloom, co-founder of Gracefully Graying. Welcome to Gracefully Graying Live. We are connecting you to information and resources in Michigan and beyond to help you create and maintain a productive and vibrant life as we are all gracefully graying. And as always, a thanks to our sponsors. Enjoy the live stream.
Welcome to Gracefully Graying. I'm your host, attorney and co-founder Henry Gornbein. Today on Gracefully Graying, I'm very pleased to welcome as my guest Dr. Amanda Leggett, who is from the Institute of Gerontology and Department of Psychology at Wayne State University, and we will be discussing this very important topic of how families care for individuals living with dementia. Amanda, welcome to Gracefully Graying.
Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about your background and the focus of what you're practicing?
Definitely. So I can take my background all the way back to high school when my parents said it's time to get your first job kind of outside of babysitting for small children. And so family at my church worked at our local assisted living facility, and I got a job as a waitress there. And I found most of my coworkers absolutely hated the job. And I found that while food services maybe wasn't for me, I absolutely loved working there and getting to know all the residents and all of the things that made them tick and their food orders, but also about their lives and just their wisdom. But it really, in that time, opened my eyes to all of the mental health challenges and cognitive challenges that can be present in settings like this. So I think as a high school student, it really piqued my interest and also helped me kind of identify my calling, because I found, in contrast with most of the other high schoolers working with me as waitresses in that facility, I was one of the few that stuck around there instead of going to Chili's where you could actually get real tips. So I went on to college to pursue the study of psychology with a specific focus on the psychology of aging. And then I went to grad school to specifically specialize in gerontology and studying aging and mental health. And there in graduate school, I had the great fortune of working with one of the pioneers in the field of dementia family caregiving, Dr. Stephen Zarrett. And so that's really where I found this current area of research that I am in. And it really spoke to me, I think, family caregiving, because it centers around this huge issue in aging of dementia. It's something that's greatly feared, I think, as people age. But I've always been interested in working with all age groups. So, as I mentioned, I babysat small children for many years. I've worked with youth groups, for example. And so one of the things that's so interesting about caregiving is that it's intergenerational. It's not just spouses providing care for their spousal partner. It's also adult children. Increasingly, we're seeing grandchildren in the mix, friends, other family members. And so that's kind of how I landed there in family caregiving. And I'm very interested in my work and kind of the mental health outcomes of family caregivers and different ways that we can kind of target and tailor our approaches of working with family caregivers to make it a more positive experience for them, because it can be very stressful.
Amanda, what are some of the major challenges of family caregiving?
Goodness, there are many. So we know dementia is a progressive disease. At least currently, there is no cure. So while sometimes there's good days and bad days, it tends to progress and get worse over time. And so you're starting out with maybe a close family member or friend who is changing day by day, both functionally, kind of in their ability to functionally take care of themselves. So we see decline, for example, early on in the ability to manage finances, shopping. But then as the disease progresses, there can be challenges in more simple daily tasks like bathing and getting dressed. So over time, a family caregiver is increasingly helping to support an individual with dementia in that way. We also see behavioral and psychological symptoms that can come with dementia. So whether it be depression or apathy, aggression, sometimes individuals experience hallucinations, delusions. Those can be really challenging, and caregivers often find those very stressful because these are things that they never experienced before with the person for whom they're providing care. So that's a new thing that they're having to kind of learn to manage and how to deal with. And then there's kind of increased emotional support and supervision that comes as the disease progresses. So it's kind of helping to manage and navigate these daily tasks of living increasingly as the disease progresses. And sometimes this can also include medical care tasks. If an individual is hospitalized, that can come with a huge variety of challenges. So it's a lot of care coordinating, care navigating, working between different individuals who may be involved in that care process. Then also alongside kind of this cognitive deterioration that comes with a dementia. So over time, for example, it's a common experience that the individual with dementia may no longer recognize you. And for a spouse or for an adult child, that can be a really emotional experience. And so it's a huge array of challenges, really, that we see.
Amanda, why don't you tell us about some of the caregiver styles that a family or friend may utilize in taking care of someone who has dementia?
Definitely. So this is a topic I get really excited about because this has been the focus of my research for the past several years. So I actually got a grant from the National Institute on Aging to study this topic specifically. So a lot of the research in family caregiving has looked at caregivers in a pretty one-size-fits-all way. And I, for a long time, had this strong belief in the work I was doing with caregivers that they do actually vary from one another quite a bit. Not everybody manages in the same way. And so my grant from the National Institute on Aging allowed me to explore this in depth. And so I did these long interviews with caregivers where I asked them kind of open-ended questions. So I would say, like, tell me about challenges you've been experiencing lately in your caregiving, and what went on in your mind when this was happening? What did you say? What did you do? How did you react? How did you kind of navigate this challenge? So caregivers would kind of walk through their process for me of how they navigate these things. And then we also use a variety of scales, like 1 to 5, strongly disagree, strongly agree type questions, to really get at a diverse array of ways that caregivers kind of manage care. And through this process, we were able to analyze our data, and we identified really 5 distinct caregiving styles. That's the word that we use, kind of profiles or caregiving styles that span different cognitive approaches, so different ways that caregivers are thinking about their approach to care, and then also different behavioral approaches. So what are they actually doing in the moment as they're navigating caregiving challenges? And so I'll explain briefly the styles for you. So the first one we identified is called the externalizer. We came up with these names. That was challenging. So the externalizer tends to have a superficial understanding of dementia. And what I mean by that is they can say in words they know that their relative or friend has dementia, but maybe they view the symptoms of dementia as intentional or volitional. So the individual with dementia is forgetting this to get on my nerves or to bother me. And then they tend to react with some helplessness, frustration, anger, placing blame. And in their behavioral management, they do use kind of a lot of frustration, kind of blaming. They have a pretty rigid approach, so they have a hard time adapting as different challenges come up. And then we have our next style we call the individualist. I think of the individualist as a lone wolf, if you will, someone who tends to take all of care on their own shoulders, as opposed to helping delegate out to different friends and family members for different tasks. So their approach is very linear, kind of point A to point B. This is what I do. I just do it. I just take care of it. And I just get things done, rather than really involving the individual with dementia kind of into managing these different caregiving challenges. So it's a pretty straightforward, direct lone wolf, kind of all on my shoulders approach. Then we have our style that we call the learner, and the learner is a little bit in the middle of this spectrum. So what really stands out about them is they're really trying hard to navigate these caregiving challenges, but we see them continually kind of getting stuck or hitting a wall. So they'll tell us, we're trying this, we're trying that, we're trying and erroring these different strategies, but nothing seems to be working for us. And we're excited about this group because we feel this is a group who recognizes that their approach isn't working for them, wants to change what they're doing, is just kind of having some difficulties in their care. We view this as a group that would really benefit from caregiving interventions like support groups and things like this, where they can actually really get some additional perspective on the trial and error they're using in their caregiving approaches. And then next we have a style we call the adapter. And the adapter really always expects the unexpected. They have a pretty big arsenal of behavioral approaches that they use in their caregiving. They're kind of ready to meet whatever comes their way. One of the quotes that we use kind of for this group is that they're able to roll with the punches, if you will. So they show a lot of acquired adaptability. They talked a lot in their interviews with me about how they learned over time what worked and what didn't work, and they're able to really adapt as different challenges arise. And then finally, we have a group that we call the nurturer. And as a in contrast with the kind of adapter that really acquired over time this adaptability, the nurturers seem to really have natural kind of mastery, and caregiving just really comes to them quite naturally. So some of the caregivers in this group were nurses, for example. And behaviorally, they use strategies like teamwork. So rather than the individualists or externalizers who tended to go more alone in their caregiving, the nurturers really talked with us about how they would work with the individual with dementia when something went wrong with a challenge to kind of deal with things together. So an example I love about this is a gentleman who was having difficulty getting his wife to brush her teeth in the evening. And so he turned it into a little game where he would turn on a timer and they would play some music. And it was something that they would do together. And then when the timer ended, they could stop brushing their teeth. So rather than, yelling at her or saying, you have to brush your teeth, he turned it into a little bit of a game that they could play together to accomplish the task. So we also see pretty strong contrast between some of these styles, particularly the nurture and that first one I mentioned, the externalizer. The externalizer would really try to kind of bring the individual with dementia back into the reality. So if the individual with dementia, say, is talking about their mother and wanting to go home and see their mother, an externalizer might say, well, your mother died 30 years ago. Whereas a nurturer might kind of jump into this new reality with them and say, oh, tell me about your mother and what's your favorite thing, and kind of enter into that conversation with them rather than trying to bring them back into the current day kind of reality of the situation. So I could go much more into depth about this, but that's kind of the brief overview of these styles that we're seeing.
Amanda, you've raised some curiosity, and that is one better than the other from what you're finding in your research? I mean, if there was an ideal person or category, what would that be?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we actually try to avoid saying there's one best style or one worst style. The reason being is in working with caregivers, we don't want anyone to feel like, oh, you're the worst style or you're the best necessarily. I believe each style has strengths and room for growth. So each style definitely has things that they're doing really well and areas where they could improve. That being said, we do see that these styles vary in terms of outcomes specific to care. So we do tend to see that nurturers, for example, report the most positive outcomes. So they report less stress, more positive affect. They tend to report higher quality of life in the person for whom they're providing care, where we do see that the opposite is true for our externalizer group. Our externalizer group tends to report more caregiving stress, more burden, and lower quality of life for the individual with whom they're providing care. One really interesting thing we did in this study was we actually took saliva samples. So we collected spit, which sounds pretty gross, but it's pretty neat because we're able to actually analyze saliva for some physiological markers of stress. And we even saw at the physiological level that externalizers had elevated stress profiles, whereas our nurture group had better stress profiles, even, inside the skin. So I don't necessarily think that the nurture is the best and the externalizer is the worst. As I said, each one of these groups has unique strengths and room for growth. I think each could benefit from intervention in different ways. And one style can change. So we do see that individuals change over time, depending on kind of what are the stressors or challenges that they're facing. So it's not like you're in one style and you're set in that style for life. We do see that these are modifiable and different styles may be better in different stages of care. But we do see that our styles vary in terms of outcomes that are important to caregivers.
This is helpful. Tell us about some broader networks that provide care for individuals with dementia.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So that's kind of the new area that I am working on in my research, in addition to the caregiving styles. So one thing that really stood out to me kind of in my prior interviews, for example, as I was interviewing caregivers about their styles, we in the caregiving field tend to look at what we call a primary caregiver. So who is the individual who has primary responsibility for an individual living with dementia in terms of their care? And that's pretty universal. Most caregiving studies think about it in that way. And what I started realizing is it's kind of an artificial construct, because most individuals are part of a broader network of multiple family members or friends or neighbors who are involved in different capacities in terms of supporting an individual with dementia. So I have a new grant this year that I received from the National Institute of Aging, where we're going to be looking specifically at that. So we're going to be trying to better understand who's part of these broader teams or broader networks of family caregivers and how are they functioning. So kind of using similar methodologies as I described of thinking about different profiles of family caregivers, what about different profiles of these networks? So we can think about this in terms of who's part of this network. So maybe a spouse, maybe an adult child, maybe a daughter-in-law, maybe a niece or nephew, maybe a grandchild, a neighbor, a friend. Oftentimes, individuals with dementia have multiple people who are supporting them. And sometimes individuals are providing care in a variety of ways. So maybe they're providing help with those functional tasks like I talk about. They're supervising, they're providing emotional support, they're helping financially. Maybe they're taking someone to doctor's appointments. And then sometimes there's an individual family member who comes in and provides one sort of assistance. So maybe, the grandchild is the one who takes grandmother to the doctor's appointments or drives them to the store. So we see different family members and involved in different tasks. So that's one way we can explore networks. But we can also look at this from a psychological perspective. So I'm also really interested to better understand how these networks are functioning psychologically. So is there one member in the network that's carrying the burden of stress, whereas other members are less stressed? Kind of what's the variability in the network look like? What's the level of disagreement? So that's a big issue we often see sometimes, for example, in networks that have multiple adult children or multiple family members involved. Families don't always agree about what's the best thing to do with mom or dad, for example. So what does that look like within the network? So we're going to start to explore both who's in these networks, but then also how are they functioning psychologically? And then how do these network profiles relate to outcomes for individuals with dementia? So something that we see clinically, for example, a lot of my colleagues work clinically with individuals with dementia and caregivers. And we often see, for example, individuals going into the emergency room because the caregiver burned out and couldn't take it anymore and didn't know where else to turn when something went wrong. And then what can happen is that individual can get stuck in the hospital setting because maybe they're at risk for falling or other issues that keep them in that setting, which is really not good for anybody. And so we're interested to see how these family networks are functioning and then how that leads to important outcomes like health service utilization and even mental health for the individual with dementia. So you might have to have me back in another couple of years and I can give you more of the results from our research, but that's what we're just digging into to explore and understand a bit better.
You touched on it, and really, how important is the mental health and well-being of the person or people who are involved as the caregivers?
It's huge. It's huge. And this is really what I think interests so many people in the field of family caregiving. If you look at the general population and you look at rates of mental health disorders, for example, they're generally low, things like depression and anxiety, but they're significantly higher in family caregivers for individuals with dementia. So it's not uncommon to see, for example, 20% of individuals with clinically significant depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms. So we do see mental health concerns being very prevalent in this community. And outside of even mental health disorders, stress and caregiving burden are very high. And then these can be key predictors for other mental health concerns. So this is why we in the field are really interested in coming up with interventions and supports and services that can help relieve some of that stress and burden for our family caregivers. I think we're also increasingly seeing adult children in what we call the sandwich caregiver setup, where they're providing care maybe for a parent who has a dementia, but they're still providing care for their own children in the home. So they're kind of sandwiched in between these two types of caregiving responsibilities. So it can be very time consuming, it can be very overwhelming. It can take away from one's job if an individual is at work and concerned about what's happening at home, or having to leave work to fulfill caregiving responsibilities. So there's just so many different ways that caregiving can impact mental health. But fortunately, there's a lot of really great minds working in this area. And there are some wonderful interventions that exist and wonderful services that are out there that have shown demonstrated impact on reducing stress, like adult day service, for example, where individuals with dementia can go and be stimulated with activities and other individuals. It gives the caregiver a break, and meanwhile can be a really positive experience for the individual with dementia as well. So there's a lot out there, but it can sometimes be hard for caregivers to get over that hump and be willing to seek help and supports.
Amanda, we're running out of time, but I'm curious about one thing. Is there a correlation between aging and dementia? In other words, as you get older, is there more and more of a prevalence for dementia?
Yes, 100%. In fact, aging is the greatest risk factor. So the older you get, the higher or increased risk you're going to have of developing a dementia. So with each passing year, that risk increases. So yes, there's a very strong association between aging and dementia. But one thing we know now, in fact, there's a wonderful report out there put out by one of the main medical journals called The Lancet, on kind of key risk factors for dementia. And the good news is many things are modifiable. So we can't change how we age, but we can change things that we do as we age, like our exercise, our diet, and other factors like this that do also increase risk. And those are things that are directly in our control. And that's the good news.
Amanda, we're out of time now. I want to thank you so much for being our guest on Gracefully Graying.
My pleasure.
I want to thank our sponsors and our viewers for supporting and watching Gracefully Graying. Amanda, thank you again.
Thank you so much.